Hello there, and welcome to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. My name is Chrissy Morgan, and today we are with Darlene West, and we'll be discussing the Christian Waldschmidt Homestead, located in Camp Dennison, Ohio. Hello, Darlene. How are you doing today?
Hi, Chrissy. I'm doing just fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's go back to, I guess, just about the beginning. Christian Waldschmidt, who was he and what brought him to this area?
Christian Waldschmidt and his family originally were from Germany. They were staunch Lutherans who left Europe because the Lutheran Church was starting to lose some of its principles, and like the Puritans, they came to the colonies for religious freedom. They settled in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area. Now, they were a very aristocratic family, well educated, had quite a bit of money, so the transition was pretty easy for them. They built churches, they had schools, they had an import-export business, and Christian Waldschmidt took up the campaign of the Revolution and served as a soldier during that war.
During the Revolutionary War?
He did.
Oh, okay.
So after the war, because he was had a pension from the the colonial government, he was entitled to land in the Northwest Territory. Being the smart businessman he was, he knew he needed water access, so he chose this area because of the Miami River and the Ohio to make transportation of his goods an easy process. 1794, he and a group of craftsmen came to this area, claimed his land. He also purchased an additional 1,100 acres from John Cleves Sims, and he started his community here.
Sims as in the Sims Township?
As well as in Sims Township, yes, and as John Cleves Sims as in Cleves, Ohio, and that area. So he was the manager of this part of the Northwest Territory, and it was through him that all of the veterans picked up the land that they were entitled to.
Gotcha.
So he purchases this land. He leaves a group of craftsmen here, as is displayed by some of the tools that you'll see later, and he was able to start building his homestead. In 1797, the main house was started, and in 1804 it was completed. During that time, many families came out here to work, clearing the land, building the buildings that were necessary to establish a community, and Waldschmidt was welcoming everyone. It was going to be, and for my generation, I use the word commune with a disclaimer. It was a community. Everyone was invited to be part of it as long as they were a contributing factor. You were encouraged to have your own business, amass your own wealth, and go off and then establish your own homestead farther west.
What were some of the items in this community?
Waldschmidt himself was quite the entrepreneur. We tell students when they come that he was like the Bill Gates of 1800. He was highly educated, he had a lot of money, he had great ideas, but he was smart enough to know he couldn't do it without the help of everyone. So he had blacksmiths, he had woodworkers, and he had stonemasons. He developed a grist mill, a paper mill, a lumber mill. He had a fulling mill for making linen. He had churches and schools as well.
All on his property, on his homestead.
Property. If you would step out onto the property now, you could do a 360-degree turn, and for as far as you could see in any direction, it would have been his land. But he was very generous. He offered schooling to all the children of the community, regardless of what their family situation was. He had the church available. He was welcoming to everyone in that if you were an indentured servant and still hadn't paid off your indenturement, he would pay that and then leave you to live your life with no commitment to repay him in the future. By that time, Ohio was a free state that had been admitted to the Union, so there was never any worry about having slaves here.
Wow. Tell me a little bit about the house. I'm guessing the stoneworkers he had worked with helped to build the home itself.
They did. Because of the geology of the area, we are at the point where the glaciers stopped during the Ice Age. So all that wonderful stone that turned into our buildings had been gathering at the edge of the glacier, and the stonemasons were able to use that to construct the two stone houses that are here. The main house took 7 years to build. It is an architectural wonder. Not too long ago, we had to purchase new blinds for the windows. I measured all of them. There was not a window that was more than 1/4 of an inch out of square. And this is a house that's 225 years old.
That's incredible.
It's just phenomenal. The skill of the craftsmen, whether it was the blacksmiths, the stonemasons, or the woodworkers, was exceptional. But that was part of their German ingenuity and pride in their work.
Apparently. Is the wood floor the same as what it...
We have some original wood flooring. We decided rather than have boards randomly scattered throughout the house, our museum room, which was the general store that was developed by Waldschmidt, has all original flooring in it.
Wow. Is there anything else about the house itself that you'd like to share?
The house is kind of a contradiction in terms. We have a very, very traditional kitchen. Would have been a summer kitchen in any homestead throughout this part of the country. But when you walk out of the kitchen into the parlor and the dining room and the rest of the house, it's like a different world. It's high ceilings, it's big windows, it's rooms that other homes would not even have thought of having. It was designed for a family and a business because the store was there, the tavern was there in the basement.
There was a tavern in the basement while Waldschmidt's family was there.
Absolutely. He thought he was going to have a winery. He brought grapes with him from Pennsylvania, but they were the wrong kind of grape and they didn't survive the summers here. So being the man that he was, he looked out and realized he was growing wheat and rye and corn and had plenty of water and decided, I can make whiskey. And if I'm going to make whiskey, I'm going to have a tavern to sell the whiskey. It was also one of his largest exports. He exported thousands of barrels of whiskey to Europe every year.
To Europe?
Yes.
Kept those connections, I guess.
He did, I guess. Yeah.
How many people were in his family that would have lived there?
He had the first Mrs. Waldschmidt and their growing children came in 1804. He had mainly daughters who survived to adulthood. The first Mrs. Waldschmidt died shortly after they moved here, and he married quite quickly, as was typical in that age because you had to have
family management.
And the women were definitely the managers of the family. He married again, they had another daughter. His daughters who grew up here were quite the catch, and local men who came to work for Waldschmidt married into the family. We as women say that of course they married up because they married the boss's daughters, but they became an important part of the community because they were Kuglers and they were Turpins and they were Raglins, and those families eventually became essential to the development of Sims Township.
Interesting, interesting. So how long was Christian Waldschmidt at this residence?
Unfortunately, during the influenza pandemic in the 18-teens, he passed away from the influenza. So he was only here about 10 years. But he had established his family. He had the sons-in-law to take care of the business. Unfortunately, when the Depression of the 1830s hit, it affected these families as well, and through over-speculation, they lost quite a bit of the family fortune, but were able to regroup when it came time for the Civil War and for this turning into Camp Dennison. The Union Army came through and decided it needed a mustering center here in this area, and it was decided that this would become Camp Dennison, named after the governor of the state at that time.
What was it called before?
We were New Germany before, in honor of the Waldschmidt's home
And Christian
family.
Waldschmidt called his homestead New Germany.
Correct.
But then when the Civil War happened, they called it Camp Dennison.
Correct. And that was because governors tended to name things after themselves, and this was an important place. So during the Camp Dennison days, the Union Army leased the property from Jonathan Kugler, who was managing the property at the time, and it was quite a restoration of the family finances because they paid $11 an acre per year, and they rented approximately 500 acres.
Oh, wow.
So that allowed Jonathan Kugler then, after the war, to move over towards the Milford area and really be essential in the development of Milford and the Millcroft in that area.
Interesting. When it was used as a mustering center, so the whole land was used for training Civil War troops?
It was. We were down to about 500 acres at that time. They had given up a lot of the farming. But Camp Dennison served as a mustering center, which means either coming into the Army or leaving the Army at the end of your service. We entertained about 125,000 soldiers here.
Oh my.
So some of them were here for just days at the beginning of the war, when an entire town militia would come and be ready to go off and fight. As the war progressed, troops weren't needed as quickly, so they were able to stay here and train a little more. We were an artillery training center, and if you are familiar with the area, artillery was shot off towards the Loveland area, and every now and then we still get a call from somebody saying, we found another cannonball in our backyard.
A cannonball, not just the bullet, but the cannonball.
The ground elevations were quite different back then. So as communities were developed and landfill was brought in and all of this kind of stuff, every now and then these cannonballs percolate to the surface and somebody will call and say, you know, we have this cannonball, and we try and share with the Loveland Historical Society, so we take turns taking the cannonballs.
Such a fun
it is.
Part of
and it's
being
a great way to teach kids. All of a sudden,
absolutely.
You know, my neighbor has a cannonball, and now we get a history
This is what
lesson.
it is. So. I had read somewhere that the Waldschmidt building was used as a hospital.
The entire grounds during the Civil War, the first small stone building that was used originally for the home of all of the craftsmen who were here building the big house, lived there. And then during the Civil War, that building was used as a guardhouse. After the Battle of Shiloh, all of the hospitals in the South were pretty much saturated with wounded. So the Union Army gathered wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate.
Oh, really?
Put them on flatboats and sailed them up the river here to Camp Dennison. And we became a hospital for both armies, to the point where at times we had 1,200 soldiers here as patients at the same time. Now, it was a hospital that was taken care of by nurses that fit into two categories. One set of nurses were volunteer civilians. We had a few of those. They were even allowed to bring their families onto the property and build homes during the time of the war. But the most significant crew of nurses that we had were members of the Sisters of Charity. Sister Anthony, who was the Mother Superior of that particular order of nuns, was a nurse. And so when she recruited young women to join her order, she trained them all as nurses. And as early as the 1850s, they were going throughout the East Coast taking care of soldiers because of measles epidemics, where there weren't enough civilian nurses who would go in and take care of them. Well, the Sisters of Charity are headquartered here in Delhi. Their Mount St. Joe College is on the property of the Sisters of Charity Mother House and the retirement village right now. And so there was a great connection with this area and the nuns. The only problem was the nuns weren't allowed to live here on the property. Kind of that separation of church and state.
Right,
things.
okay.
And they couldn't travel back and forth to Delhi all the time because it was much too far, covering that area in wagons.
But they needed the help.
Yeah. So they wound up staying at the Methodist Church in the local village so that they wouldn't have to transfer all the time. But these women were crucial to the survival of thousands and thousands of soldiers. Without
From both
them,
sides.
They would have been, yes. We did have a cemetery here at one time, but all of the Union soldiers have been moved to Spring Grove Cemetery, and all of the Confederate soldiers were moved up to Camp Chase, which is just outside of Columbus, where the Confederate cemetery is. And that's where the prisoner of war camp was as well.
Gotcha. So let's fast forward a little bit. What happens after the Civil War to this property?
Okay. For a while, it was kind of like a temporary home from time to time for Waldschmidt relatives. The last of the family members who lived here were Josephine and Julia Kugler, two women, sisters, who kind of came and went as they chose to. And towards the 1880s or so, the house was pretty much abandoned. We had animals roosting everywhere. We had corn growing through the floorboards of the house and all of that. And then in the 1930s, Chester Kroger and his wife Julie, he being one of the grocery store Krogers.
I was about to ask.
Now, by that time, though, the Krogers had sold the business to other interests, but the name was still there. Chester and Julie loved the architecture of the stone buildings. They were enamored by the German architecture, and so they purchased the land. But we found out that even in the 1930s Depression, the Krogers were affected by that as well, and maintaining a historic building was very expensive. So about 1939 or so, the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, got involved in that. A member of the Marymount chapter came across the building, realized it was the home of a Revolutionary War soldier, and realized that we had not honored it with a plaque. Now, DAR, Daughters, do plaques well. We want to make sure that history is preserved. She contacts Mr. Kroger and asks if we can put a plaque, and he suggests instead that the DAR become the protectors of the property, meaning that he would deed over the property to us if we would vow to take care of it forever.
At that time, how many acres was the property?
It was about 7 acres.
7, okay.
So from December of 1939 to March of 1941, it was worked out through Mr. Kroger and the state officers of the Ohio Society that we would be deeded the property, including the buildings that existed, and receive a check for $5,000 to help take care of the property. It was a fantastic acquisition for the Daughters, and especially for the community, because we had vowed that we would take care of it and get it to the point where it looked like a piece of history. Things were going wonderfully. We had volunteers, we had donations of materials until December of 1941. And then World War II started, and the renovation of the property was pretty much put on hold until families could come back together, have a chance to reach some kind of normalcy, and it was then in the early 1950s that restoration began again.
So it had paused all efforts to restore the facility. It pretty much paused.
Well, when you figure that the materials were now
right.
And our volunteers were either serving in the military or were women working in the factories for the war effort, it forced us to take a step back.
Yeah.
And so after the 1950s, we started changing things, trying to make it a little more presentable. It was a huge task. Eventually, we started opening up for tours on Sunday afternoons and kept expanding and kept refining. At one time, we looked like a wonderful antique store because the policy was if we have 3 of something, why would we only show 1? So we put 3 out, and before long, you had a path you had to follow, but it was beautiful antiques that we had. We decided, though, that that wasn't our mission. Our mission was supposed to be making it into a home museum.
Yeah.
So now we feel like we can walk in, and any Waldschmidt ancestor could walk in and feel at home.
Oh, that's fantastic.
We did have a wonderful compliment a few years ago. We had a gentleman who had fought in the Korean War, and when he came back from Korea, he worked for the Hyde Park Lumber Company. And his job once a week was to gather up all the scrap materials, load it into a horse-drawn wagon, and bring it to us to use as restoration materials. So he hadn't been here in, probably 60 years. And he turned around and looked at us after looking at everything, and he said, "You've done a good job." Oh. And I think that's kind of the best reward we could have gotten.
Yeah.
He felt like we had done it justice.
You're following the purpose of what your original goals are.
So that's our goal. We share it every Sunday. From June until the first weekend in December, when we have our big Christmas open house, which is our gift to the community. We decorate in the early 18th century mode, or 1800s mode, and have docents in costume, and we have cider and donuts and welcome the community, and it's our gift to them.
That's lovely.
Time.
Rumor has it that some presidents may have been associated with the property as well.
One of the presidents that we have a loose relationship with is Ulysses S. Grant. His great-great-grandfather, Captain Simpson, was a compatriot of Christian Waldschmidt. Came to this area, found that it was too populated, and so he moved back east to the area of Georgetown, Ohio. That's where the Simpson family eventually became the Grant family, and where Ulysses S. Grant grew up and has his homestead. So we have that association.
Fun.
So, we do have a bizarre little relationship. John Cleave Sims is the one who sold Christian Waldschmidt the property. John Cleave Sims' daughter, Anna, became the bride of President William Henry Harrison, which is really kind of unique because they then are the grandparents of Benjamin Harrison. His wife became the first President General of the DAR. So it's kind of a little full circle that we wound up with this here.
Interesting.
Now, there have been stories that during the time of Camp Dennison, that President Lincoln was here. That, through the investigation of the Civil War Roundtable, has shown that most likely, almost certainly, President Lincoln was not here during that time.
Okay.
They feel that the only time he came close to this area was when he was on the train, on his funeral train going back to Springfield, Illinois. We have reports of women who said they corresponded with Lincoln and they have letters and all this kind of stuff. I think that was just...
If you could say he was there.
Part of the romance of the history.
Yeah.
We do know Lincoln came through this area on campaigning, when he was campaigning for the presidency, but he stayed in the Cincinnati area. He didn't come out this far.
Gotcha.
So wish we could claim him, and we do pay credit to him in our Civil War Museum. But unfortunately, I don't think we can claim that he was here.
Well, it's good to have that known now.
Is.
Now, behind us, we have some fascinating wagons and other forms of transportation. Do you know anything about it?
I do. The Conestoga wagon, which is the red and blue one over our shoulders, came to this area in about 1750. Conestoga was the type of wagon that it was called. It was brought here by the Gatch family as they pioneered into the area. The Gatches are still very prominent in the area as doctors and lawyers and judges, so we have them to thank for that. We've done a great deal of history investigating with this with the help of our National Society. We do know the colors are original.
Oh, they are.
School kids think that's very unusual, and many people do because they're so bright.
Yeah.
Figuring that we were still in an area where there was a lot of unsettlement with the natives who were here, it seems like, as kids say, they were kind of traveling with a target on the side of their wagon. What it was, though, is unlike the trains, wagon trains that went out west, where they traveled 10 and 15 and 20 wagons at a time, these pioneers traveled maybe by themselves or with one other wagon. By having brightly colored wagons, if you were traveling parallel with someone who was several miles away, you would catch the colors as you traveled through the wooded area, and they would then converge and spend some time together. Oh. So this wagon is very small. It was meant to be put on a flatboat, sail down the river as far as possible so that they wouldn't have to travel on the ground very much. The wheels are wooden, so they would get gummed up with the dirt and the gravel and things in the trails, and the wheels would have to be removed about every 50 miles to be re-greased and ready to travel some more. These are small enough that they could be pulled by horses or oxen, whatever you might have, mules if you had them. And the only thing that was transported by the wagon were the household goods. People did not ride on the wagons. You know, everybody walked, and so it was quite an accomplishment to be able to travel this way.
It's fascinating that you're saying this is one of the smaller wagons when it's like much larger than a minivan of today's standards.
Well, they talk about the prairie schooners that would leave St. Louis and head out west towards the Rockies were twice this size.
Amazing.
But they were meant to be homes for the families as they traveled for months on end. This was not that way. A Conestoga wagon like this was meant to travel one summer, and then you would stop and you would set up a homestead and you would stay as long as it was profitable to you. So.
And then what about the one behind us with this beautiful fringe?
We have President Garfield, Surrey.
Oh.
So President Garfield, one of our Ohio presidents that unfortunately was assassinated, was traveling in a Surrey to a high school or to a college reunion.
Pardon me, just what is a Surrey?
A Surrey, that's what this wagon is. It's a
like
small, kind of open-aired carriage that was drawn by one horse usually.
Okay.
So it would have a driver and then somebody sitting behind them in that area. President Garfield was on his way to this college reunion. There was an assassination attempt. President Garfield did not die immediately from his wounds. Unfortunately, it's one of those situations where he died mainly from the treatment that he received, in that the doctors were doing everything they could to find the bullet and clean the wound and get him taken care of. The methods that they used for bullet removal and some of the treatments just did more harm than good, and eventually he died of sepsis. So it was a long, slow, painful death that he had. Mrs. Garfield then had 7 children to take care of. She returned to Northeast Ohio, where that homestead is. Presidential pensions and insurance and that kind of thing were not very substantial at that time. So one of the things the country did was had a coin campaign. And they encouraged everyone to send their coins to the White House. And then that money was sent to Mrs. Garfield to the tune of about $360,000.
Oh my word.
So she was able to live a very comfortable life. But at the beginning, she wouldn't accept charity. So the reasons the Surrey has been preserved is a family in Akron, Ohio, acquired the Surrey as an act of kindness. They gave her money, she gave them the Surrey. It wasn't charity, it was kindness. Well, that family happened to be the Firestone family.
Oh, wow.
And they put the Surrey in a warehouse, and it sat forever. And eventually they were ready to tear the warehouse down, and someone remembered that the Surrey was in there. They were able to salvage it through a lot of things that I'm not actually sure about. It was given to our state regent of the DAR as a gift by her chapter here in Cincinnati, and we have it here. We're not sure why it's not at the Garfield homestead in Northeast Ohio, but we're not complaining.
No, I guess not.
It is in the original condition it was when it was stored. We have been advised by historians to leave it as is, that it has much more historical value than if we would try to bring it and get it into better condition. It does have patent leather fenders. It has lanterns that could either have gas in it for lights, or they would put flowers in it during the daytime to make it look pretty. It was warmed by a soapstone that was put into a fireplace and wrapped in a blanket, and the blanket wrapped around the passengers. So we've had this for a while. And then our last vehicle is a Civil War wagon.
Okay.
It belonged to a family here in the Mechanicsburg area. It was a farm wagon. When their militia came to Camp Dennison to go off to war, they brought it with them. Now, wagons and surreys and coaches and things like that during the war were only useful as long as you had a purpose for them. If they broke, if you didn't need them anymore, it was customary to leave them by the side of the road, hoping that another unit would come by and use them. Sometimes that unit was with the other army. And we know through the restoration that they did and the layers of paint that are on our wagon that it had been used by both the Union and the Confederate armies during the time of the war.
Wow, you never really think of that.
You do, but
the gear doesn't have a say.
But they were smart.
Yeah.
You know, if there was a wagon with a little bit of repairs, we can use it. Why wouldn't we do that? You know? So how it got back to the right family with the right unit it's a lot of conjecture and all of that, but we do know that it eventually wound up back in Mechanicsburg. The family used it for hay rides and pumpkin festivals and all kinds of things, and then when they were finished with it, they made a gift to us of that wagon.
That's lovely. Let's talk again about the Waldschmidt residence, the homestead itself. What does it take to restore it today?
Lots of time, lots of money. We are on the National Registry of Historic Buildings. That in itself is quite a burden.
Can I ask, do you have a plaque?
We do have a plaque.
Okay.
We proudly have a plaque. It binds us to follow certain rules in that we will try and keep the building as original as possible. And when we can't use original or similar materials, we use modern materials that are as close in appearance and structure as the originals would
So
be.
going along with that, some buildings need to have updated electricity.
We do.
You do. So you have followed all of the
We did.
current rules for people to be able to access it.
As we added things, we had to do everything to code. So it has electricity. I'm sure at one time it had gas lighting and all of that, but it has electricity. We do not have plumbing in the main house, just because if we would have heating problems or something, we wouldn't want the building destroyed that way. It did have plumbing at one time, but we have since removed that to help preserve it. Anything we do new has to be to code, but we have tried to make all the renovations that we've had look as period correct as possible.
Sure.
You know, there's always the roofing that needs to be done.
Are the windows original?
They were original to the time the family lived there, but not necessarily original to the house when it was built. They are certainly not new. They are, you can see the flaws in the glass and all of that. But we've been extremely fortunate that because of the care they took it during construction, we've had to worry very little about structural problems with the house. We don't have,
Amazing.
other than when the water table on the ground is saturated, we don't have water problems. We've just been very fun. We don't have cracks. We have a building that has survived because of the care that was taken when it was built.
Right, and we're talking centuries.
1804 was when it was finished.
Amazing.
So you're looking at 220 years at least.
Amazing. Is there anything else about the building or the homestead itself that you would like to share?
I think what it shows between our Civil War collection and the items that are in the house, which are either Waldschmidt possessions, family possessions.
Oh, you have possessions from the
we-
family?
We have some.
Okay.
And we also have anything that's in the house is age appropriate to when the family lived there. I think the biggest thing we have to offer is a 200-year span of history. We see how people came and used their ingenuity and their common sense knowledge to establish, successful communities, and how that was projected into the future so that the area grew and industry was incorporated, and yet people kept those values that were most important to Christian Waldschmidt, was to be a contributing member of the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think it's important to preserve places like this?
If we don't, any reference we have to our history is gone. I had a group of people here this morning, and in our Civil War Museum, we have handwritten letters from soldiers to their loved ones at home. And we talk about the poetry of it and the graciousness of the people writing them. And my only regret is that they are in cursive. And we have school children who come to visit who can't read that, or who go to Washington, D.C. and see the original Declaration and Constitution and can't read our history because they haven't been there. Thank goodness it's coming back into our curriculums, and hopefully in a matter of years, children who come here and visit us will be able to read it with their own eyes the history that we have to offer. Because if they can't, we're going to lose a tremendous, valuable asset that we have had growing up that the future generations might not.
And how can someone maybe watching this help preserve this history?
They have the opportunity to come and visit us. We are, as I said, we're open on Sundays through most of the year. We are solely independently funded by our members here in Ohio. We do have an admission charge that is next to minimal. One of our biggest pleasures is our DAMR members are, because they contribute, our guests. But more importantly, any veteran or active duty military member is always our guest, because this was their home and what they fought for all those years. Of course, we're never opposed to donations and all of that, but that's not our purpose. Our purpose is to be here to share this so that other generations will know what happened here.
That's fantastic. Darlene, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Well, thank you for coming.
Absolutely. Again, my name is Chrissy Morgan, and we're with History in Your Own Backyard. I've been speaking with Darlene West, and we were at the Christian Waldschmidt Homestead in Camp Dennison, Ohio. Thank you for watching. Remember, travel slowly and stop often.